Marvel, an incredibly successful studio, now owned by Disney, has succeeded where so many others have failed, in establishing a consistent franchise, a cinematic universe where a new film is always about to come out, and more are in development, production, and post-production that, and here's the critical part, people actually want to go and see. So come gather hither, studio executives, put down the glass of semi-skinned blood, stop plotting the memes movie, gather hither and I will tell you why. It's Hobbitweed. Marvel Studios, the movie manifestation of Marvel Comics, emerged as an important player in the industry by licensing their films, the first being Blade in 1998. Before that, they had mixed success in optioning their characters. Blade was very successful, and followed by X-Men in 2000, which was even more successful.
My people brought you here for medical attention.
I don't need medical attention.
Yes, of course.
Then there was Spider-Man, Hulk, and the Fantastic Four. Not the Fantastic Four they messed up, the one that was always going to be bad. But the point is that these were great money spinners, but not necessarily for Marvel. Marvel made money off of them, but they only got licensing fees. The lion's share was claimed by the production studios. Marvel went through rounds of funding in the 2000s, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the franchise of films that share continuity, the envy of all franchises, started with Iron Man in 2008. Disney snapped up Marvel Studios at the very end of 2009. They knew a good thing when they saw it. And look at those box office numbers, but more importantly, look at those release dates. 2 films a year, and then 3 films a year, and the profits, somehow, aren't dwindling. Yet for most of the franchises, the general trend is downward. The obvious explanation is that Marvel isn't making films that directly lead into each other. Ant-Man isn't episode 20. Sure, it may share the same universe, but it isn't a sequel. Well, what about Solo? That's a film that's part of a beloved franchise, and it's not a sequel or really even a prequel exactly. It's a standalone film. Yes, about a character already established, but in a way that informs little beyond its own confines. And I can say that because all the Star Wars films featuring Harrison Ford were written long before Ron Howard could be conjured by saying his name in front of a mirror 3 times. Perhaps more importantly is the wealth that Marvel has in terms of its characters. It has a tremendous amount of very varied characters that it has been developing organically for the last 50 and 60 years. Han Solo, sure a great character, was not written as a lead, but the people in the Avengers movies, they were. They all have their own backstories, fully fleshed out backstories I might add, that are extensive and much loved by an established audience. It almost feels bizarre, doesn't it, to watch a mainstream movie where you don't need to get the backstories of the characters from a prequel or a side story because they've already been established. Doing things linearly. God, I wish I had the cognitive ability to plan such things. Not that I needed to know that Han Solo was less rogue, more doofus in the past. Marvel can make movies that aren't sequels or prequels, but are about established and beloved characters. That's because it has, and listen here studio executives to a phrase that might make your skin crawl, a relevant repertoire that is not only marketable, but has already been successfully marketed. You see, Universal has its own cinematic universe, the Dark Universe, now on hold. Not forever, just because The Bride of Frankenstein deserves a lot of pre-prod. I mean, after Tarkovsky died, who could possibly do it justice? No one cares, except hardcore fans, about a movie focused on the Invisible Man, and no one cares, apart from the hardcore fans, about a movie centered on Boba Fett. That doesn't mean that those characters can't be likable or enjoyable, and it doesn't even mean that those films can't be good. But people grew up with Spider-Man. And I think long before Marvel made Iron Man, long before it licensed Blade, Marvel was far more pervasive. DC, the only real contender, which in film terms has only a sliver of the output and a fraction of the business of Marvel, is, I would argue, far less pervasive in the minds of potential audiences. Yes, it's still well known, but I think the reason Marvel and DC's fortunes have reversed over the last 25 years is down to this. Yes, you can keep making the same Man-Bat movie, yes, people will go and see it, although Superman seems to be harder to keep going, but other than that, I'd say the appetite for DC's stuff is more limited. Don't get me wrong, there is an audience, there is profit to be made, but just looking at Warner's plans, you can see that it isn't enough for them. Marvel is going to be able to last longer than any other franchise because it doesn't need to rely on a cycle of churn where the same IPs are used all the time and generate fatigue. What would happen if a James Bond film came out every year? What would happen if 3 came out every year? A James Bond film, a Q film, and a young James Bond film, where he has long hair and highlights. It would get boring pretty quickly, wouldn't it? Stop writing these down, Paul Feig. These aren't suggestions, they're bad ideas. Why can't you be more like your brother? Ugh. What do you mean you're not related? Emulation never lives up to the subject that, in this case, it's ripping off. You can be a great painter, a technical master, but if all you do is copy Caravaggios, they're never going to be considered as good as an actual Caravaggio. DC, aka Warner Brothers, I guess because in corporation land no one can actually speak truth to power without diluting it into words like complementation, acts as though it isn't trying to cash in. Oh, we just happen to make our movie about superheroes that get together in a single film too, but it's very different. It's all very different. Our films about men in tights are really dark and gritty, which is exactly what people want from Superman actually, thank you very much. I mean, until the reshoots and the inevitable bastardization of even that. And this brings me to the crux of the problem. Now hear this because it explains a lot of the problems in Hollywood. The greedy are short-sighted. No one has the patience to plant a seed and let it grow. They want the oak tree now. But look at Marvel's history. You can argue that the Blade and Spider-Man et al. Licensing in the decade previous to Marvel's Phase 1 laid the foundations for a successful multi-character, multi-timeline franchise. But DC wouldn't wait to do that. Its focus and the offerings trying to compete with Marvel are far less about meeting characters and more about getting to the Justice League. Marvel really did get the industry straining to develop rival franchises, in the form of cinematic universes, that could become even half as successful. And I think it's a real testament to the power of wishful thinking that, for example, anyone thought a Ghostbusters film without the original cast and without the original flavour could even come close to a series that has been developing its fans and maturing for generations. It's no leap of understanding to see why Spider-Man is going to have more mass appeal than The Mummy, or why a dozen characters as popular as Spider-Man are going to outperform a series or a franchise that doesn't have as many characters and hasn't been as prevalent in the consciousness of the audience for as long. But even then, with stories that are much beloved and do have mass appeal, this mode isn't necessarily something that should be reproduced. Star Wars isn't Marvel. The first 3 movies in that series have a pretty definitive end, which is why in the late 90s, when they decided that cow needed milking, they went for prequels. But my point is, Star Wars doesn't or shouldn't need to compete with Marvel. Not everything can or should be a cinematic universe or an enduring franchise. Do people want a new Star Wars film every year? It doesn't seem so. Harold Ramis and Dan Aykroyd didn't write Ghostbusters with spin-offs and origin stories in mind.
Make sure you're tweeting hashtag Ghostbusters.
Jurassic Park 3 happened because the first film was a success, not because people who desire nothing but more really wanted it to be. No one was there on the set of Rocky 1 saying, so after the 4th one, the montage one, we'll get the first 3 seasons of Rocky Babies into production. No, Paul. And I don't think Marvel did it like that either. They've spent a lot of time getting to where they are, and I'm sure they always had a plan as to how to develop their universe, but it doesn't feel inorganic or forced. They're not developing characters just to cash in or to push spin-offs, but rather making films about characters that are already very well known and much beloved. Perhaps it is all about money. I mean, surely. But there's an appetite. DC hasn't necessarily done badly, but it can't get the same footing. Keep in mind that this is the only real contender to Marvel. What do they have planned to compete against Captain Marvel, another Avengers film, and another Guardians of the Galaxy? Oh, Aquaman? What is Shazaam? Does that star Shaq? I'm up for that. How will Suicide Squad be misrepresented by its own trailer this time? Well, at least you know it can't be worse. In short, Marvel has a far more robust, varied, and collectively appealing back catalogue than their rivals. No amount of wishing will make the decades of groundwork laid out by Marvel replicable by people who want to sign the contract for the fourth film before the first is even released. It's almost as if the best thing to do is just make compelling movies that you believe in, see which ones are successful, and patiently build from there, like they used to do. It certainly will be interesting to see what happens in the next 10 years for Marvel. The king always loses their crown, eventually. But before that, we have Marvel reacquiring numerous rights and making them fit for purpose to look forward to. Cough cough X-Men, Fantastic Four, and anything else Disney gets when it buys up the rest of the entertainment industry.
For Disney, for Marvel, and for Sony, the best Spider-Man is the most economically, is the thing that they need too.
Well, that's it. That's why Marvel has been continually successful and probably will be continually successful for at least another decade, in my opinion. I wanted to use the last few seconds of this video to say thank you for watching. I hope that my content and the way I present it are improving. That certainly is my aim. I hope that is happening. I wanted to also say that, honestly, this time last year, I was under the opinion that YouTube only cares about views, perhaps understandably, and therefore I had to make as many videos as quickly as I could. And now I feel as though I've progressed to a point where I feel as though YouTube only cares about views, perhaps understandably, but I don't. So I wanted to say, if you are a long-time viewer, thanks for sticking with me. See you next time. TriStar, they're not Marvel. Orion, they're not Marvel. Columbia, they're not Marvel. Warner, they're not Marvel. MGM, they're not Marvel. UA, they're not Marvel. Bad Robot, they're not Marvel. A24, they're not Marvel. Vertical, they're not Marvel. Lantern, they're not Marvel. Sonic, they're not Marvel. Vertigo, they're not Marvel. Fox, they're not Marvel. HBO, they're not Marvel. Pixar, they're not Marvel. Ealing, they're not Marvel. Miramax, they're not Marvel. Studio Canal, they're not Marvel. Anchor Bay, they're not Marvel. Silverlight, they're not